Following the failure of its Constellation-class frigates program, the US Navy is clearly at a crossroads. It must decide whether and how to pursue a future fleet of reliable frigates that can take over lower-intensity missions from the destroyers, and weigh that up against the risk of another shipbuilding failure and wasteful spending. And it's now clear what the US Navy has chosen. It will pursue a new frigates design based on the US Coast Guard's Legend-class national security cutter, a ship that is far smaller than the cancelled Constellation-class frigate. This appears to be closer to the model of an affordable class of ships that can be mass-produced. While sensible, the decision reflects a Navy struggling to reconcile its force requirements with the realities of cost control, constrained shipbuilding, and a desire to rein back ambitions. The new FFX frigate, derived from an existing American hull, represents both a pragmatic reset and a test of whether the service has learned from decades of acquisition failures. The recently cancelled Constellation class was conceived as the Navy's answer to the troubled Littoral Combat Ship program. By selecting a largely off-the-shelf European design, the Franco-Italian frame, the Navy hoped to acquire a capable, affordable, and timely frigate with minimal development risk. Instead, Constellation became an object lesson in what happens when requirements creep overwhelms good intentions. Over 5 years, the American design diverged so far from its parents that commonality dropped to roughly 15%. Costs ballooned, construction lagged badly, and by 2025, the lead ship was only around 10% complete, with delivery slipping to 2029. At nearly 80% of the cost of a destroyer, but offering only a fraction of its capability, the Constellation no longer made strategic or financial sense. However, its cancellation left the Navy with a glaring gap in its future force composition. That gap is real and pressing. The Navy remains heavily dependent on the Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers to do most things. At the same time, the Ticonderoga-class cruisers are approaching retirement, and the littoral combat ships have failed to mature into the flexible and adaptable contributors they were promised to be. In this context, the absence of a viable frigate is arguably a structural weakness. Without frigates, the Navy risks overworking its destroyer fleet and reducing readiness. Given these requirements, the Navy's decision to base its new FFX frigate on the Legend-class national security cutter is understandable and perhaps even sound. The Legend class is not a theoretical design. 10 cutters have already been built and commissioned between 2008 and 2024 in the US Coast Guard, giving it a long and well-documented operational history. Designed for blue water operations, it has proven endurance with a range of around 22,000 kilometers and the ability to sustain 90-day deployment. Built to 90% military standards, it incorporates features often absent from Coast Guard patrol vessels, including robust damage control, degaussing that reduces magnetic signature, reduced radar cross-section, and survivability to US Navy standards. While the Coast Guard cutter is optimized for lower threat environments, the underlying design provides a solid foundation for further navalization. At roughly 127 meters in length, and with a displacement of about 4,700 tons, the Legend class is significantly smaller than the roughly 7,300-ton Constellation design. This reduction in size is not really a weakness. It is a recognition of what a frigate is supposed to be and what it isn't. A frigate is not a miniature destroyer. Frigates are meant to take on day-to-day missions, operate in groups, focus on niche and more specialized missions like anti-submarine warfare, and free up larger combatants for the most demanding missions, especially area air defense. Frigates should be affordable, more numerous, and crucially, a more expendable combatant. Their value lies in presence, persistence, and numbers rather than in firepower or sensor coverage. By choosing a smaller hull with modest armament, the Navy is implicitly accepting that not every ship needs to carry a full suite of high-end capabilities and powerful air defense radar. In theory, this allows the fleets to grow in a more balanced and sustainable way, rather than concentrating combat power in a small number of expensive and overstretched warships. In its current Coast Guard configuration, the Legend class is modestly armed. A 57mm main gun, a phalanx close-in weapon system, electronic warfare equipment, decoys, and crew-served weapons. It lacks a vertical launch system and the layered air defense that would define a true modern frigate. However, space, weight, and power margins were deliberately built into the ship, and Huntington Ingalls Industries has spent more than a decade developing frigate variants that add anti-ship missiles, torpedoes, and better sensors. This prior design work reduces technical risk, at least compared to starting completely from a clean sheet. The Navy's conceptual illustration of the FFX frigate suggests a cautious approach. We have some details about its intended armament. The ship will be keeping its 57mm main gun from the Coast Guard ship. The Mark 1110, the US Navy's adaptation of the Swedish Bofors naval automatic gun. A little surprisingly, the US Navy has reportedly confirmed to certain defense media that the first flight of the FFX will not include a built-in vertical launching system, or VLS. This dispels the uncertainty around where is the VLS, and explains why it was not present in the initial renderings of the FFX. But the US Navy also said that, much like the Arleigh-Burke destroyer program, they expect to upgrade the FFX over time through successive flights. And that should mean, and this is just my interpretation of what they said, that a Mark 41 VLS could be installed on future flights if actual operations and combat experience deem that to be worthwhile. Previous frigates designs based on the Legend class by Huntington Ingalls showed 12 VLS cells just behind the main gun for the evolved Sea Sparrow medium-range anti-air missiles. The Navy also said that minimal design changes will be incorporated into the first flight, so we can get hulls into the water as soon as possible, which suggests to me that the VLS was omitted, at least initially, to minimize development risk and to expedite procurement. Indeed, adding a VLS on such a vessel may be no easy task. It's not immediately obvious where a vertical launch system should be installed, especially if the ship is to keep its main gun. The VLS cannot be placed too far forward on the bow, owing to the need for depth, so it would have to be placed in the narrow area between the bridge and the 57mm gun, and that means rearranging whatever is already there. That raises risk of design errors and delays. The Navy must be wary of repeating the same mistakes as with the Constellation class in terms of design overreach. So it makes sense to exclude the VLS for now. Furthermore, taking advantage of the longer range air defense enabled by a VLS, such as the SM-2 and the SM-6, would require having powerful air search radars. Indeed, it would ideally have multiple air defense radars in different bandwidths, geared at handling different jobs. You would want an airspan radar for long-range volume search, and another X-band radar for target illumination and fire control at the very least. Given you probably want the latest and greatest, that would mean active, electronically scanned array radars, instead of the older, passive, phased arrays. But all of these take up a lot of power and space, and are likely to cause stability issues on a small ship. A warship based on the small Legend-class cutter may not be able, or at least not suitable, to incorporate all these advanced radar systems. And if that is the case, that would reduce the effectiveness of a vertical launching system and its more advanced air defense missiles. There's also no need to put tomahawks on these frigates either, given that land attack missions can be assigned to the larger destroyers and cruisers, eliminating another reason to have a VLS. However, the lack of a VLS does substantially reduce the frigate's air defense capability, so it would require the protection of more capable air defense warships armed with VLS, such as destroyers, at least when operating in heavily contested waters. Alternatively, the frigates can operate only in the rear areas or in lightly contested waters, thus reducing the need for heavy defensive capabilities. The FFX will have a modest suite of point defense weapons. A defensive weapon not found on the original cutter is a Mark 49 launcher for the rolling airframe missile for close-range defense. This is positioned just in front of the helipad. There are unspecified countermeasures mentioned by the Navy. These are probably electronic countermeasures such as flare and shaft decoy launchers that aim to confuse the guidance system of incoming weapons. There's also the option of installing modular weapon systems, one of which, mentioned by the Navy, is a counter-drone system. We see that, in the illustration, a very prominent raised platform has been added to the bottom front of the forward main superstructure. This seems likely to be used in the future as a mount for some type of point defense weapon. This could be, for example, a phalanx seawers in a super firing position of the main gun. At the stern end of the ship, we see in the drawing two slanted launchers for anti-ship cruise missiles. These are very likely the naval strike missile that the Navy is bringing into service on its various warships. There appears to be room for up to 16 naval strike missiles in 4 quad launchers, although if that was the case, there won't be room for much else. The naval strike missile is a significant upgrade on the older Harpoon anti-ship missiles found on some US warships. In terms of electronic systems, it seems highly unlikely that the FFX will operate a radar system on the same power level as the Constellation-class frigate. It's also unlikely to operate the Aegis combat system, especially if area air defense is not a key mission. The power generation and the cooling requirements are likely too big. The FFX will likely receive a more capable medium-range radar than that on the Coast Guard cutter and Koa today. The convention for the US Navy during the Cold War is to assign frigates to anti-submarine warfare. If this is a role of the FFX, what matters then are torpedoes, towed array sonar, potentially a variable depth sonar, and the anti-submarine helicopter. Given that the Legend-class cutter already has a helipad and a hangar, and a tactical air navigation system, otherwise known as the Tarkan. And we also see a helipad in the drawing. It's basically certain for the FFX to deploy at least one helicopter. The elephant in the room is of course the prognosis of the program. The US Navy has a pretty poor record of building new warship classes over the past 2 decades. However, the Navy insists it has learned its lesson. Secretary of the Navy John Phelan have emphasized that requirements will be locked down before construction begins, and that change orders will be tightly controlled and will have to go through him. The acquisition strategy is built around a lead yard, followed by competitive construction at multiple yards, with an emphasis on expanding the domestic industrial base. On paper, this approach addresses many of the structural problems that plagued previous naval shipbuilding programs. Yet, skepticism is warranted. The Navy's recent shipbuilding history is littered with well-intentioned reforms that's failed in practice. The Zumwalt-class destroyers were meant to revolutionize naval warfare, only to be truncated at 3 ships after cost spiraled out of control. The Littoral Combat Ship program promised modularity and affordability, but delivered underarmed vessels with persistent mechanical issues and limited combat relevance. Constellation itself was supposed to be the antidote to these failures, and instead became the latest example of design overreach. Against this record, the FFX frigate must be judged not by its conception, but by its execution. The decision to use a smaller, proven hull is sound in principle. It aligns with the strategic role frigates are meant to play and acknowledges the limits of the Navy's acquisition capacity. The decision to omit a vertical launch system is debatable, but the rationale of minimizing design changes and delivery risk is commendable and shows a Navy that has learnt from its mistakes. However, discipline will be everything. If the service attempts to transform the legend-based design into something beyond an affordable frigate, the result could be another expensive disappointment. There is also the broader question of survivability and expectations. A frigate based on the Legend class will not be optimized for high-intensity combat against peer adversaries. That is acceptable, provided the Navy is honest about how it intends to use these ships. Frigates should not be treated as substitutes for destroyers in dangerous environments. They should be employed where their endurance, numbers, and moderate combat power offer the greatest return on investment. Accepting this trade-off is essential to avoiding the trap that sank the Constellation. Ultimately, the new FFX frigate represents a crossroads. It could signal a return to realism in US naval shipbuilding, where roles, cost, and capabilities are aligned with strategic needs. Or it could become another chapter in a long story of overreach and disappointment. The choice to build on the Legend-class Coast Guard cutter is a rational starting point. Whether it leads to success will depend less on the ship itself than on the Navy's ability to resist its own worst instincts. If the service can truly deliver a simpler, smaller, and more affordable frigate by 2028, it will have taken a meaningful step towards restoring balance in the surface fleet's composition and achieving a tangible high-low mix. If not, the FFX risk becoming yet another symbol of an institution that knows what it needs, but cannot quite bring itself to build it.